I am working with Professor Kim Anderson in the Wine Economics Research Center of the University of Adelaide, and we have been doing some research on quantifying the impact that climate change might have on the Australian wine industry. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but given the nature of this conference, I thought it would be better to focus on this question. How can we best use econometrics to quantify the impact of climate change on the wine industry? So how can we use econometrics to assess the impact of climate change? We can do this by first estimating the impact of weather or climate on an output. There are many econometric and data-related challenges associated with this first step. For example, dealing with spatial autocorrelation and choosing the right fixed effect structure. Those challenges have been well discussed in the literature. What I have found the most difficult here in this first step is to come up with a sensible way of representing weather or climate. Most studies use just a few temperature or precipitation-related variables, but in reality, there are many variables influencing wine production. And it's very hard to summarize weather or climate in just a few indicators. Also, the way weather impacts wine production varies across regions and varieties. On top of that, grapevines are perennials, meaning that the weather in the current season affects both the current season and subsequent seasons. Because of that, I have considered estimating a dynamic model that would allow me to come up with the long-run effect of weather on grape yields. But I'm not certain that that model will be correct because perennial crops are often subject to alternate bearing. Alternate bearing is this phenomenon in which a year of high yields is followed by a year of low yields and vice versa. So I'm still uncertain on how to model this issue, and I'm open to any suggestions you might have. Moving on for now, once we have the estimates of the impact of weather or climate on an output, we can use those estimates to quantify the impact of climate projections. The main issue here in this second step is that we are assuming a no-change scenario. That is an assumption that all variables remain the same, except for those associated with the climate. On top of that, if we are using panel data, we have another issue, which is failing to account for long-run adaptation. And to clarify, I'm not talking about technologies that are yet to be developed. I'm talking about already available technologies. And this is because when using panel data, we are relying on the short-run estimates of the impact of weather shocks to quantify the long-run changes in climate. What this means in practice is that with panel data econometric models, we can sometimes be overestimating the impact of climate change. And the climate econometrics literature has discussed this issue at length. But I believe that for the case of wine, this is less important. And this might sound controversial, but I will explain why I'm saying this. Grape growing is a capital-intensive activity with very long investment horizons, usually spanning decades. And that means that adaptation processes are slow. These slower adaptation processes translate into smaller differences between short-run responses to weather shocks and long-run responses to changes in climate. On top of that, there's another reason why not accounting for long-run adaptation might be less relevant in the case of wine applications. And if we look at annual crops, for example, some regions might adopt the technologies of other regions when their climate shifts. But if we look at wine growers are more inclined to maintain their unique wine producing styles despite climate shifts. To give you a dramatic kind of made up example, but just for illustrative purposes, if the climate of Napa Valley changed towards that of the Central Valley in California, I will doubt that the wine growers in the Napa Valley will adopt the production systems of those in the Central Valley. They will rather try to maintain their wine stars as much as they can. There are also other challenges associated with this second step, independently of whether we are using panel data or not. One of them is extrapolating beyond the observed values in the data. For example, for the research we are doing for Australia, we are only relying on climate change projections until 2050. Because if we would go beyond that, if we would use more distant climate change projections, we would have this issue of extrapolating beyond the observed values in our data set. Also, some things are hard to account for with econometric models. Examples are carbon fertilization and the intensification of climatic events, both which are very important. And there are also other sources of uncertainty, such as statistical uncertainty and uncertainty in the climate change projections. That's why it's a good practice to use a wide variety of climate projections and a wide variety of emission scenarios to perform sensitivity analysis. And it's also good to know which projections are more or less reliable. Temperature projections are usually way more reliable than those for precipitation. Now we'll talk about some research we are doing for Australia. We are using climate econometrics to assess the impact that climate change might have on the wine industry. We have already done some research on this topic in the past, but now we have compiled a new viticulture database. We have better climate data, thanks in part to a new shapefile that we have that shows the exact location of the vineyards across Australia. We have new irrigation data, and for some regions, we have firm level data. So we are working on this more comprehensive analysis than the one we have done before. This is still work in progress, but I will provide an overall picture of how climate change might affect the Australian wine industry. Climate change will likely lead to lower yields, despite a lower incidence of frost. This is because all regions are projected to become drier, all of them, and water availability is projected to decrease. Higher temperatures will likely lead to lower quality of grapes and wine. Most vineyards in Australia are already planted in climates that are quite hot for producing high quality wine of the mainstream varieties planted there. And with climate change, all regions, all of them, are projected to become hotter. What this means is that wine growers might need to use varieties that are better suited to warm climates or source grapes from higher elevations or latitudes. However, this doesn't seem to be the case. Most of Australians' vineyard area is planted to a few mainstream, mostly French varieties that do better in cooler climates, and 2/3 of wine production takes place in 3 regions that are already very hot. There's some discussion about alternative varieties that do well in warmer climates, but the truth is that only a very tiny fraction of the Australian vineyard area is planted to those varieties. There's also discussion about newer, cooler regions that have high potential for producing high quality wine, like Tasmania. But if we look at Tasmania, it only represents 1% of the Australian vineyard area. So the bottom line is that when it comes to climate change adaptation, the Australian wine industry has a long way to go. So here I have talked about climate econometrics and some of the challenges we face when applying it to wine applications. I'm interested in talking to people here on better ways of using econometrics or other statistical models to quantify the potential impact of climate change on the wine industry. Also, I have talked about the research we are doing for Australia. We are planning on expanding our analysis. We have already started working on a similar project for California with Sarah Smith and Julian Austin from UC Davis. And we are planning on doing similar studies for other countries. So I also look forward to talking about future collaboration opportunities, and especially with industry, because there are many advantages of using firm level data as opposed to regional level data.